There we go. Well, welcome to our Facebook town hall on people before profiteering. And I've got some great guests I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment. I will just right at the outset say that we're on the traditional territory of the Kakite First Nation, the Coast Salish peoples here in New Westminster, British Columbia, and that this broadcast will be posted on YouTube within the next few hours. So we're doing Facebook Live today, and we'll be doing it, posting it on YouTube. So for folks who want to see it on YouTube, you'll be able to see it tomorrow. I have some terrific guests. We're going to be talking about the response to the pandemic, but also the importance of not having the profiteering that we're seeing. And I'd like to flag by starting off in the Second World War. We had very strict policies and a federal government that was very clear about this. No profiteering during the course of the Second World War. That is tragically not what we're seeing this time around in the pandemic. And we'll be giving you more information through the course of this broadcast. I'm going to start off by introducing one by one and ask them to respond to an initial question. Our three terrific panelists tonight, starting with Toby Sanger. Toby is a good friend, known him for a long time, the Executive Director of Canadians for Tax Fairness. He has worked as an economist for the Canadian Union of Public Employees, as the Chief Economist for the Yukon Territorial Government, Principal Economic Advisor to the Ontario Ministry of Finance, and also as a private consulting economist. Toby, thank you very much for being here today. And just to start off, I'd like you to answer the question: how important is it that a lot of the corporate bailout money that is available through this pandemic, through the Liberal government, is actually can go to companies that use tax havens?
Peter, I'll just go ahead and share with you that it's so important that the last time I tried to talk to Toby about this, we also had technical difficulties. Toby is not actually on the call right now, but will be joining us momentarily as he fixes his audio problem.
Thank you very much. Well, and I will go back to him. Thanks very much, Matthew. I'll go back to him when he gets back on. This is the wonders of the virtual universe. I'll go next to our second guest, Angela McEwen, somebody I've admired for some time, senior economist at QP National. Her primary focus has been understanding the impacts of Canadian economic and social policy on workers. And she holds an MA in economics from Dalhousie University in Halifax and a BA in international development studies from St. Mary's University. And you'll often see her on social media putting forward important progressive ideas. Thank you very much for being here, Angela. And can you answer the question, to what extent do you see the banks benefiting from this pandemic? Do you see the banks providing the kind of shared sacrifice that so many Canadians are being asked to undertake, because we are supposed to be all in this together?
Yeah, it definitely seems like the lesson that policymakers got out of the financial crisis in 2008 was the need to act quickly in terms of liquidity, or providing that, backstopping that debt. And part of the problem is because we've shifted debt to being mostly private and having all of this private debt, that now the economy kind of depends on having that debt there. And so yeah, a lot of the assistance that came out right away, other than the CERB, was all around making sure that mortgages were secured, making sure that banks had the money that they needed. And then the Bank of Canada also making sure, again, that provinces and the federal government could borrow money and be able to have that debt. So both public and private debt, but certainly huge reliance on the banks. And then we saw actually mortgage rates go up. The bank's prime rates went up when the Bank of Canada lowered rates initially. And certainly they were only offering, mortgage ease to people if they really asked for it and they met certain circumstances, right? So there was a lot of, the federal government was saying that they were counting on the banks to be good actors, and and they're not in it to be nice, right? They make a lot of money and they're always going to get their cut, right?
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right. And I should share with you something that's hot off the press. Just received it just few hours ago. It's from the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions Canada. And they appeared before the Finance Committee virtually last Thursday. I asked a simple question: how much support is the banking sector getting through this pandemic? And here's their response. On the amount of support provided to the banking and financial sector. They talk about the OFSI's, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, lowering the domestic stability buffer, which provides $300 billion of lending capacity for Canada's largest banks. The Bank of Canada having several large-scale asset programs. Again, they evaluate that at $300 billion. And then CMHC's Insured Mortgage Purchase Program is $150 billion. So all told, hot off the press, in fact, this is the first time people will have learned about this, $750 billion, $750 billion in supports, either through regulatory relaxation or other methods to the banking sector. Angela, how appropriate do you think that is in the midst of a pandemic when seniors are struggling, families are struggling, students are struggling, and there doesn't seem to be the supports in place for Canadians?
Well, exactly. It's not neutral when you are supporting banks in this way. Renters are suffering. People that are trying to buy their groceries at the low end. This doesn't trickle down. This is basically another version of trickle down economics, right? And it's not trickling down to people. We're seeing a lot of people are really struggling. The CERB will probably be ending very soon for some people at the end of June. So, and then they'll be without support unless they qualify for employment insurance. So what we're seeing is I guess, it's just that it's trickle down economics again, and trickle down doesn't work. We need houses for people. We need basic public services. We need that financial income support to help people bridge the gap. And that's what's really important.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, the third guest, and before I come back to our first one, is my friend Matthew Green, one of the rising stars of the NDP, the new member of Parliament for Hamilton Centre. He was a longtime municipal councillor. He has been very outspoken on numerous issues in the House of Commons, very eloquent, and is our national revenue critic. And Matthew has raised the issue of Amazon. Matthew, simple question. Is Amazon profiteering during this pandemic crisis?
Oh, undoubtedly. And I think that the early numbers had them at $25 billion of worth added to Jeff Bezos, while simultaneously his company undertook a very aggressive anti-labor position, a union busting position. They've had deaths in the warehouses. They've added work to their workforce while continuing to suppress the wages. And this is just one example, one system of an entire corporate profiteering model when disasters hit. And I think we're going to see in the weeks and months to come just exactly the types of disparities that we have between working class people and the CEO or the banking and Bay Street class, this corporate class of this country that liberal conservatives and conservative liberals love to support.
Now, you said $25 billion since the pandemic started.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's on pace right now to be the world's first trillionaire, while simultaneously his workforce is, working at bare minimum wages under horrible conditions, without benefits, without job security, with hyper precarity. And I think it is one of the prime examples of this corporatization of our economy.
Now, and it's true that they're actually rolling back wages next week for Amazon workers.
And, a lot of these big corporations like Amazon use the branding of the worker as hero meme, where they're suggesting that somehow the sacrificing of their workforce in the time of this pandemic is heroic, while simultaneously they're going to pull back on their heroes' pay. It is obscene, and I think it is one of the most insidious parts of the corruption of our democratic economy.
Yeah, then we'll come back to this issue of Amazon, of course, doesn't pay taxes to any appreciable extent either, as part of the big exemption that web giants get generally. But I will come back to our first guest, Toby. You kind of slipped out into the waiting room while we were introducing you. And I had asked the question about how important it is to actually not have corporate bailout money go to companies that use tax havens. What is your sense, Canadians for Tax Fairness? What is your sense about how this government has reacted to overseas tax havens? Are they actually taking action? And how important is it that corporate bailout money not go to tax havens?
Well, there is there's a lot of Canadian corporate money in tax havens. There's at least 350 billion and over 90 in various tax havens. That's what we've calculated from the officially reported figures. And over 90% of the large corporations in Canada have got at least one subsidiary in a tax haven. And that doesn't include companies like Amazon or Facebook or Google, because they don't officially have much of a presence here. But Amazon's a great example of this. It pays its overall global tax rate is approximately 6%, as far as we can figure that out. Most people know Amazon from the company that basically delivers everything. It's also got a massive web services division, cloud computing, and it's actually one of the most profitable divisions. So this is a massive problem. I mean, partly because these companies get much lower tax rate than small and medium-sized domestic competitors, and an unfair advantage. And so this is a big issue. Even the former head of the IMF said that the international corporate tax system is broken. Unfortunately, the Canadian government has not done much on this. There's been a few closing of these various loopholes, but at the same time, they have allowed a lot more corporations and wealthy individuals to hide their money, partly hide their money, but also bring the money back from tax havens, basically tax-free to Canada. This has become a big issue. We got overwhelming response to a campaign that we did to try and get the federal government to apply some conditions to some of the funding. So the funds weren't used for profiteering. They weren't, so that they wouldn't be used for executive compensation, share buybacks, everything else. Now the government did respond on some of that, but their condition that they applied on in terms of tax havens was to say that companies, large companies that had been were guilty of tax evasion couldn't apply. Well, you know what? No large companies in Canada have actually been prosecuted and convicted for tax evasion. You go through the list; they're all, you know, mom and pop shops and others, or some individuals. I mean, we knew this, and when the government does that, and they know that it's not going to stop anybody, it makes you cynical. I don't want to be cynical about these things, but it does make you fairly cynical about that type of promise on that.
Yes, and this is not an insignificant thing, as you point out. The LEAF program, this new corporate bailout fund, it provides interest-free money for 2 years. You can pay interest in kind, which basically is a bureaucratic way of saying, "Hey, interest-free." Canadian taxpayers' money, you can take it and it'll be free for the first 2 years. The other aspect that's troubling, of course, is the past track record of the federal government in basically turning these loans, which is what LEAF was designed to do, into gifts. And we encountered this earlier this year with a tax gift that was $196 million to a Canadian company. We don't know who it is because the government won't release the name for reasons of commercial confidentiality. Unbelievable. So now we're in a situation where that loan became a gift and we don't know who it went to. This is a major problem and part of the profiteering through the LEAF program. So I'm glad you point out, Toby, that if we're talking about companies that are working with tax havens, it's possible that the benefit, that gift the federal government gives, won't even do any provide any support for jobs here in Canada. What have other countries done when it comes to tax havens? What other, for bailouts or supports during this pandemic, what have other countries done?
So a number of countries in Europe have said that they would not provide any COVID emergency funding to companies that operate in tax havens. Now, it's always a question of what countries do you include in that list, and that can be controversial. And that's also one reason why we've really emphasized the issue of transparency, and how the government needs to be transparent about where the money is going to, and also requiring those large corporations to be transparent about their own finances and how much taxes they pay. There's an emerging international movement to require large corporations to report their finances and the taxes that they pay on a country-by-country basis. I mean, it's amazing that they don't do that right now. They really should be doing that. But the government also needs to be much more transparent about where it's giving its money, not just in the LEAF program, but in other programs, to make sure that that money goes to the workers that it's intended to, and so the public and members of the public can look at that and not be bound by the government's definition of restricting tax evaders or a particular list of countries with tax havens. I mean, we want the public to be able this information to be transparent, so public and advocacy and other organizations can judge for themselves on these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're watching a Facebook Live town hall with three fantastic gifts, profiteering, people before profiteering. And we've identified some of the key areas of profiteering that we've seen during this pandemic, sadly, at a time when so many families are struggling. Now, let's talk a bit for a moment. Please send in your questions as well on Facebook Live. We'll take your questions and I'll provide them to our three excellent panelists. While we've been talking about the profiteering, there's also the people factor. And Angela, I wanted to ask you about your evaluation so far of the relief programs that have been rolled out. The NDP caucus has fought for an emergency benefit that would go to everybody. We've had to fight the Liberals all the way along, but it's not universal, but it has gone to help many people. We fought for additional benefits for seniors. We fought for supports for students. What is your evaluation of the supports that have been put in place so far, and where are the holes and the gaps? If we're trying to come through this pandemic with nobody left behind, what are the things that we need to be continuing to work on to fix these gaps so that nobody's left behind?
Thank you. I really, I think it's been amazing the work that NDP staffers and various MPs have done, both answering specific questions that people have and trying to get answers. We had workers that had been seasonal workers last summer and hadn't exhausted their EI claims and went back to work, and they were put on EI right away and told they couldn't access the CERB now. Which would have significantly disadvantaged them compared to other workers. And so there are all these little cracks like that we're seeing people fall into. So you're seeing, because of the way they set up the rules, if you didn't earn exactly $5,000 last year, but you were laid off, if you were a student, but you graduated in November instead of January, if you were a migrant worker who was laid off and you're stuck in Canada, but your SIN has now been deactivated, how do you live? What are you supposed to do, right? Yeah. So there were just all of these tiny cracks that I don't think even necessarily got a whole bunch of attention in the broader media or coverage of it, that the NDP and NDP MPs were absolutely crucial in making sure they got fixed. So one of the fixes is that the deactivated social insurance numbers can now be used to access the CERB. So there are people who were even in between different immigration statuses, right, when this happened, that were left out that will now get covered. Even getting the student benefit. But I would say that over and over again, the people who were left out were the lowest income, the most vulnerable, people with disabilities, students who had been working part-time, international students who were supporting families and didn't have access to any of that help. And what that does, or even cash workers, so workers that work through temp agencies that get paid through cash, through pay, whatever those places are, cash money places.
Payday loan places.
That get paid in cash through payday loan places that may not be able to prove they had the money or the hours, that were more likely to be pressured into coming into work sick and in awful conditions, right? So what that does is it created a class of workers who absolutely needed to go to work and were more vulnerable to the virus because of that. And so we saw this over and over and over again, and workers that were so financially insecure that they couldn't say no to their employer, and they couldn't be sure that when they said, no, I don't think this workplace is safe, that anyone would back them up. And so we've seen workers die because of this in long-term care homes, at Cargill, and it's really upsetting. And if we had had the enforcement of labor law and employment standards that were in place before, if we had the financial security, if workers knew that they had that financial security and could have said no to the unsafe work, there would be people that would still be alive right now, that would be with us right now. And so that's tragic. And it's tragic that we've created this incredibly vulnerable workforce. And my thanks go to everyone. I know Fight for 15 and the Workers Action Center are doing a lot of work around this as well, and getting victories for those workers that really need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for those comments, Angela. And we're watching People Before Profiteering, Facebook Live. We're open for your questions as well if you want to send them in. Three terrific panelists. We're talking about the profiteering that is taking place, but also what we need to do for people. And Matthew, you have been in the House this week, both in terms of the issue around sick leave that Angela just talked about, providing sick leave for the many, many workers that don't have access to paid sick leave in Canada and have to make a desperate choice. We also have just found out about the appalling extent of neglect and abuse taking place in long-term care homes in Ontario, in your province. What are your thoughts about what the NDP has achieved this week, and also what is left to do, the kinds of things that we need to fight for?
Well, I think that there's a lot in that question, Peter. First of all, I'd say that this crisis hasn't discovered any new inequalities. It has revealed inequalities that we always knew to be there. These are the very acute symptoms of the privatization and the capitalization of all of our public health care services. This started quite some time ago here in Ontario, but it's symptomatic all across the country. And so when you have a system that rewards cutting corners, that rewards suppressing wages, that rewards the limiting of the access to the critical supplies that are necessary, this is the result. Yesterday, I stood up in the House to honor Mr. Leonard Rodriguez, who passed away as a worker, a frontline healthcare worker and personal support worker. He made requests to his workplace for protective equipment. He was denied that, had to buy them from the dollar store, was sent home, was discharged from the hospital, dies 2 days later. We are seeing so much of Canada's economic, racial inequalities, and it's being laid bare right now. And so the work that we're doing in the House, Peter, as you know, is work that we've always been doing, fighting against inequality. We fought for pharmacare in the last election. Imagine what it would have been like there. We fought for affordable housing. You know, we continue to fight for a just transition for workers. What we're seeing, particularly striking in Ontario, is not just the appalling conditions of long-term cares, but the insidious relationship between donors to the Liberals and Conservative parties and folks who are senior members of the Conservative and Liberal parties who are now working in long-term care. You only have to look to the chief privateer himself, the former Premier Mike Harris here in Ontario, who was the initial driver to privatize long-term care, is now on the board for one of the largest long-term care facilities in the country. This is by far the biggest tragedy, Peter. We know that 86% of all deaths, over 5,000 of all deaths out of the 6,000 plus deaths, are traced back to long-term care facilities. And that is a symptom revealing the abject failure of the privatization of our healthcare system.
Yes, and the descriptions are catastrophic when we talk about seniors who have worked all their lives, contributed to the country, that they are found abandoned in some of these long-term care homes, literally days without anybody responding to them, going with no food or moldy, rotten food that isn't fit for human consumption. The rodents, the insects, and these are long-term care homes that, as we've seen in other sectors where we've had the profit motive in, like the healthcare sector prior to Tommy Douglas and the NDP's fight for universal healthcare, we're spending tons of money getting inferior levels of service because the profit motive basically creams off much of the resources that come, and that's part of the lesson that you point to, Matthew, in this a long-term care facility debacle, which should be the shame of every Canadian that this was allowed to happen.
I can tell you this, and I know it's going to sound hyper-partisan, but I'm going to make the statement, and I encourage people please to tune in and to follow the line of questioning that has led to this conversation. Don Davies in the health committee, phenomenal work drilling down on this. Jenny Kwan today, really putting the question to the minister in a way that they could not, well, they continue to refuse, of course, to answer the critical questions. And then, of course, our leader, Jagmeet Singh, all today in the hybrid parliament that we have here for your viewers that are at home. It was the first in history where we had both in-house and virtual participation in committee of the whole, 5-minute exchanges. We are committed to holding this government to account. And as New Democrats, we're a small caucus, 24 members, but we are very mighty in the House of Commons, and dare I say, acting as the official opposition, because the Conservatives have been MIA this entire crisis.
Yes, absolutely. And Matthew, you're quite correct to point out this hybrid parliament was it was the NDP that put it forward. We fought for it, not only fighting for the longer questioning periods, because the reality is the old style question period is much shorter, and it's sort of superficial, hot button, 35 seconds. We can very quickly see, as people would have seen today, which ministers actually understand their files and which don't. You can't get away with superficialities. You have to go into depth in this issue. And as you pointed out, Matthew, Jagmeet Singh and Don Davies and Jenny Kwan were absolutely stellar, heads and shoulders above the other questioners today in using question period for its intended purpose, to get to the bottom of the issues and to force the government to take action. We'll also be sitting throughout the summer, and Conservatives and Liberals didn't want to sit in the summer. They didn't want the extended question periods. They didn't want MPs from right across the country to participate, and we forced them to come to a hybrid parliament that allows all of those things to happen. Now we're getting some of our questions coming in. First from Pekka. Pekka asked the question about the wealth tax. To what extent putting in place a wealth tax would actually help in coming out of this pandemic and providing, putting in place the investments that we need to provide for everybody in this country. I'll shoot that first to you, Toby. What is Canadians for Tax Fairness position on the wealth tax and the importance of having those resources moving forward?
With Well, once again, I have to commend the NDP, and the NDP had put this forward in the last election campaign, and it was very interesting. I mean, I think that the NDP researchers and others didn't necessarily expect that it would generate as much revenue as the Parliamentary Budget Office came out and said it would, and that's because wealth inequality. I mean, I think most people are aware that income inequality has increased a lot, but wealth inequality has increased even more, and it's those people at the real top. The Thompsons who run the Globe and Mail, and the Westons who control most of the grocery market in Canada through their various chains, as well as pharmacy. They're the ones at the top there. They've got a lot of political influence, and they would be they're the ones that would be most affected by this. The PBO estimated it would generate about $7 billion. They're going to be coming out with another report on this this coming month, and so it could pay for a substantial amount in terms of It could pay for a substantial amount in terms of better public services, but it would also, having a wealth tax like that, would also help to redress some of these really glaring inequalities. I also just want. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was also going to say, Toby, the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer produced the landmark report last year on how much we're losing to electronic funds transfers and tax evasion to overseas tax havens, coming up with $25 billion a year that Canada is missing out in terms of the common resources that we can have to fix the affordable housing crisis and all of the healthcare underfunding and all of the other issues that are issues supposedly of not having enough resources, and yet $25 billion a year go offshore. Sorry, I just wanted to add that shout out to the PBO.
Absolutely, and just to add to that, I mean, it's people at the top of the income spectrum and the wealth spectrum who are often get out of the tax system, but it's also the people at the lower end of the income spectrum who are often not part of the tax system because they can't file their tax. They have trouble filing their taxes, and an increasing number of benefits are delivered through the tax system, whether it's the child tax benefit, the child benefit, whether it's the GST benefit, or other measures. And these have replaced social transfers, and it's and they're absolutely essential for lower income Canadians. And I have to commend Matthew Green on this issue, and other NDP MPs who have pushed this in part in Peter and others who have pushed this in Parliament, because it was we could have been in a situation where those people, the lowest income seniors and families and people with disabilities, would not receive their benefits after June of this year. We had a campaign. We pushed the government on this. It took a long time, and now they've finally made some steps on this to extend those benefits until September. But these are crucially important benefits that people rely on to survive from month to month, and it's really important that they get that they go to the people that they're entitled to. Many of them don't receive it. Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Toby. We're at Facebook Live, People Before Profiteering. I've got 3 stellar panelists. The questions are coming in hot and heavy. And I just wanted to shout out to Heather McPherson, the MP for Edmonton Strathcona, Taylor Backrack from Skeena Bulkley Valley are both watching this broadcast. Mayor Mike Hurley from the city of Burnaby is on this broadcast as well. So thanks to all of you for tuning in, as well as for Canadians right across the country. For you, Angela, a question from Tanya. With the tragedy in long-term care being exposed, is it time that we demand that we remove profit from the system? And I would add to that, to what extent has deregulation and cutting in the public service contributed to this overwhelming tragedy in long-term care?
Yeah, so I work at CUPE, which is where Toby used to work, and we represent a lot of personal support workers in long-term care and others. And so this has been an issue that CUPE's been working on for a long time, and it's absolutely shown. I mean, Matthew really laid it out that where that profit motive is there, it perverts incentives. And so there is no place for profit in long-term care. There is no place at all in profit in healthcare at all. And it's really personal for me as well. My mother actually worked in long-term care for as a nurse for her whole life. And I remember one time she started at a new private facility in a minor Saskatchewan city, and saw some of these things happening in 2000. So it's not a new thing in long-term care. It's been underfunded. It's the workers are undervalued and underpaid because care work, women's work, tends to be undervalued and underpaid. It tends to rely on a lot of racialized women who really need that money, and there's not a lot of worker power. They're felt like they're replaceable. So if they speak up, they lose hours because of how they run the labor in that sector. They use a lot of casual labor and part-time labor to try to reduce workers' power so that you don't have the ability to fight back. The Seniors Advocate in BC actually did a fantastic report comparing, just in February or January, comparing the hours that patients received care for in private homes and in public homes. And the patients in the public homes got more hours of care, and the public homes spent more money. They actually spent more time and money on serving patients than they had to by the contract. The private sector spent less time and money than they were supposed to for what they got paid, and they spent more money on the buildings and on profit, obviously, right? So it's underfunded. The labor practices are terrible. Deregulation, there's not a lot of enforcement of what standards there are. There aren't national standards, so it's different across the country, and it's
and how important are those national standards? I mean, within the Canada Health Act, raising that as an important priority rather than abandoning seniors across the country.
Absolutely, it's in the Constitution that and in the Canada Health Act that we want to support people to have the same standard of living across the country. So if you're living in northern Saskatchewan, or if you're living in Toronto, you have the same right to be taken care of, to live in dignity, and to have that care. And the care workers in those situations have the same right to dignity and fair wages, and to be the resources to do their job safely. So absolutely, the national standards, I think, are critical, and there might be I think definitely a role for federal funding as well, because we're hearing that it's expensive. Doug Ford today in Ontario said, well, we know we can't afford it, but we can't afford not to. There are definitely costs to the workers, but it's more about human dignity in life. If it was your grandmother, and if it was your grandfather, how would you feel about them living in those conditions? And it's people's grandparents that are living in those conditions, and that deserve to be taken care of. And one thing that hasn't been talked about a lot is the fact that patients' families had actually been filling in the gap. So that's a lot of unpaid, mostly female labor that those institutions lost when people couldn't visit anymore. And so it's just, there's such a gap there. There's such a gap in terms of the care, and the only way you're going to get that quality of service is if you make it public and you take the profit motive out.
And that the federal government finally adequately funds the healthcare. Yeah.
That you regulate it, that you enforce that regulation, and that you have those national standards to fund it at the level that it deserves.
Yes, absolutely. We're at People Before Profiteering Facebook Town Hall. We're coming down to the final 15 minutes or so. Questions are coming in. We're not going to be able to answer all of them, but we really appreciate people asking. The next question is from Colby, talking about Amazon. I'm going to direct this to you, Matthew, because you've been very stellar in raising this issue of profiteering. Given that they're cutting back, they haven't been providing protective equipment, and they have been cutting back on wages within the next few days. Why is the federal government contracting with Amazon for distribution of PPEs for Canada's healthcare workers when Amazon's shown such a complete disregard for the safety of its workers and even providing adequate wages for its workers?
Yeah, that's an absolutely critical question. And I think it begs the question that there hasn't been a corporate deal that the Liberals and the Conservatives haven't liked. And my concern is that, as Toby identified, that the logistics side, when the deal was first announced, the Liberals carted them out as though they were going to be the shining knights coming in to save us during this crisis. They were supposed to do this contract without profit for a while, undetermined. We don't know what that looks like. We know that they use their logistics side as a bit of a loss leader, but they're also doing the website as well, right? So it's about doing the back end of what Canada Post should be doing. But the trick in privatization, it doesn't happen in the crisis. The trick happened a decade ago when government started underfunding Canada Post. Then they started maligning the services, right? And then they blame the services. There was a big nationwide study that happened. Liberals love to go across the country consulting to find ways that they can modernize Canada Post. When Canada Post 3 years ago put forward a very compelling vision on what they call building community power, right? Which was just a very compelling vision of electric cars, of having postal banking, which Nikki Ashton has just put it forward on, of having a system in this crisis where our postal workers could have acted in the social work capacity. They could have gone door to door, checking in with shut-ins and contributing to a caring economy. But no, what does this government do? They give the contract to Amazon. And it's a very murky contract. We don't know for how much. We don't know for how long. We don't know the terms and conditions. And to put this into perspective for people, because again, sometimes when we hear billionaire stories, when we hear trillionaire stories, there's something in our society that's perverse enough where the working class is almost cheering for this to happen. They almost cheer for these people as though somehow they've earned this wealth. Peter, I'm going to read a headline to you. I'm going to put this headline to you, not as an article from The Onion or the Beaverton, but from Bloomberg. And this article came out on the 25th. And the headline reads as follows: "It's a modern dilemma for the ultra wealthy. A yacht awaits, but how to safely reach it without exposure to the germ-ridden masses." That is a Bloomberg headline 2 days ago that really perfectly encapsulates the disdain that the ultra wealthy have for the masses. And what we suggest, what we've been suggesting, the only modern dilemma that we really have for government is a wealth tax that awaits, that will fund our COVID recovery and invest in our healthcare to ensure that future pandemics are properly funded. And I'll leave the viewers with this. There are 87 families in this country who have more wealth than the lowest earning 12 million Canadians, 1/3 of the country. And in 4 years before COVID, it's going to be even more now, but before COVID, those 87 families, while everybody else was taking a beating, they amassed on average per family $800 million. That's what wealth inequality looks like. And shout out to the PPS services for keeping us safe here in Parliament Hill. I'm going to leave on that. 87 families have more wealth than 12 million Canadians.
Thank you for that. Now, we're going to go into the final few minutes, and what I'd like you to do, each of you, is articulate coming out of this pandemic. We're seeing a record amount of profiteering. The figures that I gave earlier from that supports the banking sector are equivalent to over $20,000 for every man, woman, child in this entire country. every single citizen of Canada, $20,000 each provided in supports for our banking sector alone. Now, that's true that that's not all cash outlay. That's a variety of tools, including regulatory relaxation. But what it basically means is that we've been putting the banking sector, largest corporations, Amazon, putting them first, as opposed to putting the people of this country first. And certainly in my office and in my riding, like Matthew is, we're seeing an unprecedented number of people that are seeking help. And so at the end of this broadcast, I'll give you my number again for those who are constituents in Westminster and Burnaby. We're there to reach out to you. I've got an extremely dynamic team, Dora, Saladi, and Ravina, and myself. We will do everything we can to provide the supports. In Ottawa, Munya and Harun do the same. So we're all in to provide those supports for people. But coming out of this pandemic, what kind of society can we build? Instead of investing in the very, very wealthy and offshore tax havens, what is the hope of each of you that we will be able to build coming out of this pandemic? What is that people-centered Canada that you would like to see? And I'll start with you, Toby.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to pick up on what Matthew said earlier, and that this crisis has really exposed the cracks that we really knew were there, that a lot of us knew were there, but it's also shown something else. It's shown how government can actually act very quickly and flexibly to fix a lot of those problems. Matthew was talking about Amazon, the contract to Amazon. Well, the way that the government moved to deliver some of the CERB and other programs, I mean, there have been a lot of changes over the time, but they were able to fix those problems in an emergency situation like this very quickly. And so we can do that coming out of this crisis. Absolutely, we can do that. And we can have absolutely a fair tax system. People are a lot more open to ideas like a wealth tax and other excess profits tax and other things like that. But we can change our society so it's more equitable, and so that the social safety net actually works for everybody. And so we've all been engaged in that. We can do it, right? And as Matthew was saying, why not use Canada Post? Why not use the CRA and other vehicles which we've shown can work really well? And thanks to all the public servants who have done that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Toby. You're absolutely right. We've got public institutions in place. Let's use them effectively and stop throwing money away on a small number of people who benefit, who profit and who profiteer, both during a pandemic, but normally as well with public resources. Angela, what is your hope coming out of this pandemic as we go through it and coming out? What kind of society do you believe we can build?
I think that this I agree with Toby. It has really shown people that government can act quickly, that there is an important role for government in certain public services. We're even hearing people talking about having national broadband as a public service, as a public entity, publicly delivered broadband. That would be phenomenal and life-changing for people in remote communities who right now are so removed from the types of things that we're doing right now, right? It's harder to commute to work when you don't have access to the internet or to do school. So I think there is a moment in the imagination, and there are some really big things that have been highlighted. The first of which is that the government, the Bank of Canada, is basically printing money, right? And it's huge amounts of money, and it's okay. There's not going to be inflation. We can spend that money on good things, on things that we know will help make society more equitable in the long run. But we also have to change the rules in our society to make sure that that happens. We need to change the rules. We need to rebalance some of the inequities that have gradually taken place over the past 30 years. We need more worker power. We need stronger labor legislation. We need better enforcement of labor legislation. 2 weeks of paid sick leave, life-changing. How is it that nobody in no province in Canada had mandated more than 2 days of paid sick leave before this pandemic? So being able to take off work when you're sick, which is just basic, you should be able to do that and keep your job. But more than that, right? Having that enforcement so that your employer has to follow the law, because that's what's happening to so many people. People are misclassified as self-employed, gig economy workers that aren't able to share in the full benefit of the value of the labor that they're producing. So we need that, but we also need to change this balance between corporations. Who does government listen to? Who gets the ear? Is it finance and Bay Street, or is it regular people's needs? I think that the Canadian population is fed up with the banks always ending out on top, and they're willing to take a chance on a different kind of strategy, a strategy that puts people first, that removes that profit motive, that removes that profiteering, that short-term thinking, that basically just sucks money out of the economy and sucks value from workers and doesn't build a productive, sustainable, long-run economy where we're caring for each other, where we're building streets that make sense, so we can bike everywhere we need to bike. And so mixing in a lot of this stuff, I think will be a little complicated, but I think we need to start working on it right now because people are ready for it. That's what this has given us. It has really shown that what we've been yelling about for the past 10 years is true, but now we need to double down on that and take this opportunity to actually make some of those changes happen.
Yes, thank you, Angela. And certainly polls are showing that even a majority of conservative voters support a wealth tax. They understand now that what we've been told for decades, that we have to be satisfied with just a small, the crumbs, the big guys get everything is not something that Canadians are prepared to see anymore. And as Jagmeet Singh has said, we can't go back to the old normal. The old normal simply left far too many people behind. So Matthew, what is your vision coming out of this pandemic, and what would you like to see, and what do you think your constituents would like to see?
I'd like to proudly state that I'm from the ancestral territories, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, who are governed by a dish with one spoon agreement. And that dish with one spoon agreement teaches us that we're only to take what we need and to leave the rest behind for others. So at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I'm for eco-socialism or bust. I'm from Indigenous-led eco-socialism or bust, because this capitalist extractionary economy that favors big banks, big corporations, that has this idea that society is here to serve the capitalist interest instead of having the economy serve society, it must be transformed. It must be transformed, because I'll tell you, we're going to have a second wave of this pandemic. But further to that, you know, what Indigenous teachers have been leading the way on since, you know, Teresa Spence and I don't know more right here on Parliament Hill, is that we are headed in a crash course for an ecological disaster and climate change. We have to address our rights as treaty people, and we have to treat everybody with an inherent dignity and value in their worth, regardless of what they contribute into this GDP. And so from that perspective, I'm looking for a transition that is both just, that is centering people on the planet, and that creates a caring economy where we can, Peter, use that dish with one spoon analogy and take only what we need and leave the rest behind for others.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And to conclude tonight, I'm sorry that we couldn't get everybody's questions in. Ryan does point out that we can't forget about MasterCard and Visa, and you're absolutely right, Ryan. They not just ripping off consumers, they're ripping off small business people, often who are struggling with the high margins. So we didn't have a chance to answer your question, but you're bang on, and we certainly agree with you. As I've mentioned earlier, my staff are always available to you, 604-775-57 5707. I'm showing you both because Zoom sometimes inverses it, 604-775-5707. If you need any help in New Westminster or Burnaby, we're there for you. And I'd like to thank our three guests, Toby Sanger, Angela McEwen, Matthew Green. Thank you for being here tonight. It's been a great discussion. We're still getting lots of questions and comments in. We'll be posting this on YouTube tomorrow, and please feel free to weigh in with your comments and questions. And don't forget Matthew Green's Parliament to the People, which I think is daily, right? Monday to Friday?
It is Parliament to the People. You can check it out. It's a live stream, and certainly appreciate having you leading in the House, Peter. You've been very humble tonight. Certainly where we're at right now and the wins that we've had were negotiated on your behalf. The people of Burnaby are very well represented with Peter Julian here in the House of Commons.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And for folks who want to know more about Canadians for Tax Fairness, they've got a great website, tons of information, so check that out. And of course, QP National site as well has a lot of good economics information. Please stay safe and stay healthy. And don't forget, at 7 o'clock tonight in British Columbia, we'll be honoring our frontline healthcare workers. Please go out and make some noise for those people who are literally putting their lives on the line to make sure that we stay safe and that people who fall ill are helped. Oh, thank you very much. This has been People Before Profiteering, and look forward to speaking with you all again soon. Thanks so much, and good night.
Thank you.